Hello everyone. I want to do a little demo today of some interoperability that's been pretty popular with folks, and I've got a lot of questions about it, which is using a tool for Dynamo. It's an extension to Dynamo called Rhynamo by the nice folks at Case Inc., particularly Nate Miller. And what this tool does is pretty cool. It allows Dynamo to read and write Rhino files, which is a pretty important workflow for a lot of folks, and it allows you to not have to just do straight imports of SAT files or other file formats from Rhino into Revit or into other formats, frankly, because this can be used to transport Rhino data to a lot of different places, but it does it in a particularly sort of data-oriented way, or sort of a atomic level geometry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show how to take a file from something like this, where you've got your Rhino file, bring it into Dynamo to do operations on basic curve geometry, and then use that geometry to then place real Revit elements like structural framing that then has a dynamic link back into your Rhino file. So this can be a little bit more surgical of a way to operate with or interoperate with your Rhino files. So let's take a look here at what I've got, and then we'll reconstruct it a little bit. So I've got a series of specific Rhynamo files, which read Rhino files and get particular objects out of it. It can then convert those curves into Dynamo NURBS curves, and then writes them into Revit files. So let's do this from the top, and I'll show you how to get it and how to operate with it. So let's just do file new. Well, no, I'm not going to do file new. I'm just going to get to the point here. So you can see over here I've got a Rhynamo file, Rhynamo category in my Dynamo dropdown, which is not the standard operating procedure. If you just open up Dynamo, you don't have Rhynamo. So where do you get it? If you haven't already explored it, the package manager is a wonderful source for all sorts of extensions to Dynamo. So what happens is if you go onto the package search, so again that's from the search for a package up here in the file menu, you can find all sorts of other functionality that exists out there. Like I have a couple of things to turn, groups of points into quadrilaterals, or there's a number of different tools for doing things like room operations. Andy Dykman's Clockwork for Dynamo is another great source for extensions to Dynamo. But if you look up Rhino, for instance, you can see a couple of packages. I'm going to look particularly at Rhynamo today. So Rhynamo gives you a little bit of a description of what the file is and what it will give to you. After you hit this guy right here, it will install the package for you. I already have it installed, but basically you just hit the download button, you'll get all your stuff. You can also see the basic code for where this stuff is kept. Rhynamo is an open source tool, which is great, so you can go and take a look at the code. You can even contribute back to it. So after you hit that button, you're going to download it. You're going to get Rhynamo over here in your node browser. If you want to remove it later on, by the way, packages, manage packages. This allows you to remove tool sets that you might have downloaded before. So if I click on this, I can uninstall it. If you are the owner of this package, you can do things like deprecate, which basically means that it doesn't show up in the search anymore, but other people who rely on it can still use it, and make alterations, those sorts of things. You can also go show contents, which just allows you to see sort of what all of the things are that are in it. And also tell you whether or not there's additional files that were brought in with this package. And by additional files, basically when you make a package, you can include sample files. It's not the easiest to find place. Basically in your app data roaming Dynamo packages folder, you'll be able to find additional files that came along if the publisher chose to include them. So Rhynamo has a number of extra files. So there's a little README, there's example files, Dyn files that you can open up and take a look at them. So that's the background for that bit. Now, what I want to show you now is how this can all work together. So if I go, and I'll just show this sort of piece at a time. Basic workflow is I've got my Rhino file here, which I have saved. I can go, file save as, and it goes into a subfolder, right? Just like any other workflow. So I've got my 3DM file here on disk. And no, I'm not going to bother overwriting it, but you get the idea. So I've got that. And now what I'm going to do is, the first thing that you do is you need to refer to this file. So you browse, you pick that 3DM file, and then the next part is you need to do some manipulations here. And I'll just keep unplugging and replugging these things to show you what you get all the way along. So the first thing is you actually want to do this file from path node. File from path is pretty cool because what it allows you to do is basically get a live relationship with that file. So Dynamo will now detect when that file has changed and update the rest of the workflow, which is nice because it means that you can basically work in Dynamo and have your file updating here in Dynamo. So I'm going to say I've got my file browse path, and then I'm going to get a file from path, and you can see what that is it's actually a file object now. It's rather than just sort of a string that says where it is, it says that it is a file. And when I run this guy, I get my Rhino file. So now I have my 3DM file. Now I need to do stuff with it. The way that Rhynamo is set up is that it allows you to sort of dig into your Rhino file and extract different particular pieces that you might be interested in. So, for instance, now that I've got my read Rhino file, I can pass it to get Rhino layers. So if I run that, now I can see that I've got 2 layers in my file. And I can see that back in my Rhino file, where if I go to layers, I can see I've got a rigging and I've got a shell. So if I turn off my shell, you can see I've got a bunch of curves. And if I turn on, and if I turn off my rigging lines, you can just see it's just a regular shell, just a swoopy surface. All well and good. So those layers are getting read out of my Rhino file, which means that I can basically start picking and choosing from what layer I want to look at. So if I also pass on my read Rhino file to get Rhino objects by layer, now I can pick out what parts of my file I want to look at. So I've got my rigging and I've got my shell. I could say I want all of my layers, and I'm just going to look at all of the stuff that is in my Rhino file. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to be a bit more surgical about it, and I'm going to say maybe I've got a file that has a ton of stuff in it, and instead of getting all of it, I want to just get some of it. So I'm going to say, rather than getting all of my layers, I'm going to use a get item at index, which is just a way of picking out from a list. Just to show you a little bit about what that looks like. If I go 0.3, this is just a range syntax, so I can make a range of numbers from 0 to 3. If I did get item at index on this thing, what it would do is it would get, right now, it would get the 0th item on that list. So it would get 0, or 3, it would get the 3rd item on that list, and so on. So this is nothing special to Rhynamo. This is just, the sort of standard Dynamo workflow. So if I pass in this layer, it'll just grab one of these layers off of it. So I can go run, and I can see now I've got rigging. This is actually a string output. So if I knew what the file format of my Rhino file was, I could just go and get a string node and write in rigging and pass it down the line. But this is just sort of a nice way that I don't have to make sure that I'm getting all of the names exactly right, because I might have complex names or whatnot. Alright, so now we've gotten to the point where I am getting Rhino objects by layer. And if I run that, we can see now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 objects, 6 things that are kept on the rigging layer. And again, going back to my Rhino file, I can see, well, what the hell does that mean? So if I'm just looking at my rigging file here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and also I have a dimension that I put on this, which I think is what that's picking up on for the 6th item. So I've just got a measurement that says 42. Great. So those are all my objects that I'm pulling out. Now I can further subdivide what it is that I want to get out of this file by saying there's a number of particular operations that you can do in Rhino read. So we've seen a couple of these. We've got the get Rhino file, the get Rhino layers, get objects by layer, so different ways to sort of tunnel into your file. And then what kind of stuff inside of those layers do you want to get? So you can get circles, you can get the curves, you can get extrusions. Basically, you can just pick out the things based on what kind of geometry you want to get. So I know from, because I'm familiar with my Rhino file, that here what I want to get is I want to get at these curves, right? And those curves are NURBS, right? Because it's one of the things that Rhino does very, very well. It deals with NURBS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get NURBS curves. And, I can also get things like I can get B-reps, which are the surfaces. But I'm just going to go straight for my NURBS curves. So far you can see that we don't have anything geometric in the background, right? But in pursuit of getting curves for making my structural framing, I need to get some curves out. I need to get some geometry. So now if I run this, now this is where the magic happens of taking Rhino objects and turning them into Dynamo geometry. So there I've got my geometry like so. And one of the exciting things, like I was showing you before, was that this is a live relationship. So if I'm back here in my Rhino file, I can do things like, let's see, keep an eye on this guy right here, front curve in my array. I'm going to go and I'm going to take this guy and I'll invert this bit. Now if I save my file, if I run this again, now I've got it updating to that new geometry. And if I undo that and save it again, I can run this again, you can see it comes back. So it's a very live relationship with what you're doing. If you're doing this run automatically, the moment I save my Rhino file, it's just going to update in here, which is pretty magical. But running automatically can start to create some overhead, especially when you get into creating some Revit geometry, which is the next part of this, and also where it becomes pretty lovely in terms of interoperability with Revit. So Dynamo right now is essentially being a pass-through. It's allowing you to clean up your geometry in Dynamo. It allows you to clean up your Rhino files to make them appropriate things for Revit to consume. It also means that you can get some relatively lightweight geometry going on over here without the overhead of imports. Before I actually start making structural framing, I'm just going to show a couple of things about how you can start inspecting what's going on over here. So I'm just going to use a couple of nodes over here that are, again, just sort of standard Dynamo nodes. One is geometry distance 2. What this is going to do is I'm just going to sort of inspect that what I've got coming in from my Rhino file is what I really want. So if I extract the endpoints of all of these curves, what this will allow me to do is, see all those points that just showed up? I'm looking at the first point of each one of these curves and then the last point of each one of these curves. And I'm just checking what the distance is. So 41.761, 41.761, all that. So these are all the numbers for each one of these distances between these curve ends. So I can do stuff like, I can look at 42.002, 41.761. There's some slight difference between these two. I'm not quite sure where that difference comes from. It's probably actually, oh, I know what it is. It's because I just was picking these dimensions fairly casually. Let me see here. Sorry, I'm not a big Rhino user, so I'm gonna just, I'm faking some of this. So I'm basically just picking like this, and I'm sure that there's a more accurate way of picking these dimensions. I think that that's where that inaccuracy is coming from, 42.73. Anyway, it's in the right ballpark. And I'm sure if I was picking this better, we'd see this coming up a little bit more accurately. So now that I've got my sort of verifying that I'm in the right ballpark here with the distances, one thing also to know about Dynamo is all of the dimensions inside of Dynamo are going to be in is going to be in meters. So this is 41 meters, straight up. Just how Dynamo understands its internal geometry units, which is an interesting thing because the internal geometry units of Revit is imperial feet. I mean, is a imperial decimal, which means that you get foot measurements in decimal measurements, so 10.5 feet. This particular template that I have is actually a this is the metric template, so it's actually going to be pretty transparent. Lengths is in millimeters. So what's going to happen is when I make Dynamo stuff turn into Revit stuff, it's going to be a pretty straightforward metric conversion. So let's see. So I've got some curves, and I'm just going to make the model curves, and I'm going to run. Boom. So I've got those curves out here. They're just model curves. There's nothing particularly special about them, but that's kind of the nice thing, is that they're just Revit pieces of geometry. So now I've got all the stuff coming over from Rhino, going through Dynamo, picking out what's important, placing it in the Revit file. That's all fun. But what really comes off as the payoff here is when, rather than going and making model curves, I can go and I can make structural framing. So here I've got my structural framing sort of, this is out of the box functionality again when you're running Dynamo on Revit, is saying what level I want my structural framing to be associated with. I get a drop down where I get to pick whatever structural framing I happen to have loaded into the file. I only have one structural framing type. So now if I go and I take my NURB output here, I can make some very expensive beams, I would guess, but structural framing nonetheless. So you can see here's my structural framing. Again, I didn't have to design any of this stuff. This is just part of my library of out-of-the-box functionality from Revit. So I have my structural framing. I can do things like I can use the analytic model on this structural framing just like any other structural framing tool. And I can go and I can make my alteration to my Rhino file and have it percolate back in. So again, just the way that this is all working is I've got my Rhino file, I'm saving it out as a standard 3DM file with all of its different layers associated with it. I am referencing that file. I'm doing some processing on that file to narrow it down into the particular layers I'm interested in and the particular kinds of geometry I'm interested in, and then turning that geometry into Revit elements. And again, just one of the things that this allows you to do is you don't have to rely on imports. You don't have to have messy exported files that will make your model heavier. It'll also allow you to sort of be surgical about what kinds of elements you're working on. And again, you can also do things like, if you've got these points in here, or you've got these curves in here, now you can also do the rest of your Dynamo workflows on it. Like, you could take those curves as your rigging, for instance, and do things like point at parameter, go, and you can take those curves and do all sorts of other things with them, like what would this be? Just subdividing it into 10 pieces, say. Running this sort of thing. So now I've got, now I can look at maybe rationalizing these surfaces. I've got curves that are coming in and they're all weird and wiggly. I could take all of those curves and I could do things like turn those into polycurves, which are, nice straight lines. And again, this is just, if you want to use your Rhino file as your base geometry to then do sort of more sophisticated operations on them. Here, I'm just going to turn off the preview for this. So now I've got my wiggly geometry that comes in from Rhino, and I'm saying, you know what, it would actually make a lot more sense for me to turn these into straight lines, and then you can turn them into straight lines, and then you can pass those straight lines into your structural framing for nice straight structural framing, what have you. And then, of course, you could also do all of this basic curve and rigging directly in Dynamo, or you could draw those lines in Revit. But here, this is just the ability to leverage existing data sets that are coming from Rhino is kind of the name of the game with what Rhynamo offers. So, Rhynamo, check it out. It's available on the package manager. A couple of things to note. These are known issues about interaction with Rhynamo, and we on the Dynamo team are working on this. There's a couple of niceties around code block nodes that actually get interfered with by a couple of the loaded libraries from the package manager. The way that you would see this in code block nodes, if you're a user of it, is if you do things like point, you'll see that now there's multiple point families that are now available. It used to be that you would write point and you would just be able to autocomplete with point. Because there is a point geometry element in the Rhino library, you now need to make the distinction of, are you going to do the Autodesk point or the Rhino point? So selecting that will allow you to then get the real Dynamo geometry for doing point by coordinates, for instance. So that's pretty ugly right now with the Autodesk design script geometry point by coordinates. We're working on that. But just so you know that there's now a name conflict with the Rhino, with the Rhynamo library. This will only come up if you're using code block nodes, and the workaround is to actually have this longer, more thorough name. Again, we're working on it, and we hope to have this fixed in future releases. But as of 0.7.5, you're still going to be seeing this this aspect. So that's just one thing to watch out for. Otherwise, interoperability with Rhynamo is pretty slick. And again, thanks to Nate Miller and all the nice folks at Case for providing this wonderful library. Hope you can all enjoy this one, and talk to you soon.